Mandela showed us the power of action, of taking risks on behalf of our ideals.
Well, I had said that you're one of the most humble person I'd ever met.
Nelson Mandela was a giant for justice and a down-to-earth human inspiration.
He laid a firm foundation for the South Africa of our dreams, one that is united, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and prosperous.
Racial segregation and white supremacy were central to South African society since the early 1900s. By 1950, the government began enacting brutally repressive laws through a system known as Apartheid in an attempt to maintain white supremacy forever. Apartheid included maintaining separate public facilities for whites and non-whites, denying non-white participation in government, and limiting non-white labor unions. Marriages between whites and other races were outlawed. Relations between black and white were forbidden, and all South Africans were to be classified solely by race. The cruelty of apartheid plagued every aspect of South African society. Living under such oppression, to encounter apartheid was an initiative very few South Africans were willing to take. However, a simple man by the name of Nelson Mandela took that role of encountering apartheid in a determined struggle, the likes of which had never been seen on an international scale. For some, a messiah-like figure, for others, a father figure, but for certain, a freedom fighter, Nelson Mandela emerged as the leader of the fight against the injustice of racism. Under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, a political, economic, and cultural revolution shook the very foundations of South Africa to its core, and in doing so managed to build a nation upon the foundations of freedom and equality. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, into the Tembu tribe, where he was groomed for a role in tribal leadership. After completing his primary studies at a local missionary school and attending the Clarkbury Boarding Institute, where he excelled in sports and academics, in 1939 Mandela entered the elite University of Fort Hare, the only Western-style higher learning institute for South African blacks at the time. The following year, he and several other students, including his friend and future business partner Oliver Tambo, were sent home for participating in a boycott against minor university policies. After learning of prearranged marriage set up for him, Mandela fled to Johannesburg in 1941. For the first time, he encountered the reality of brutally divided South Africa. By entering such a large city as a black youth, he received a first-hand experience of the harsh conditions of the black urban life. Blacks were treated as second-class citizens, were seen as dangerous, and were treated as unwelcome members of South African society, a hurtful reality for Mandela to observe. While studying law at the University of Witwatersrand, Mandela became actively involved in the anti-apartheid movement, joining the African National Congress in 1942. Within the ANC, in 1944, a small group of young radical Africans banded together under the leadership of Mandela, calling themselves the African National Congress Youth League. Their goal was to transform the ANC into a mass grassroots movement, deriving strength from millions of rural peasants and working people who had no voice under the current regime. Specifically, the group believed that the ANC's old tactics of polite petitioning were ineffective. In 1949, the ANC officially adopted the Youth League's methods of boycott, strike, civil disobedience, and non-cooperation. Soon they began a campaign against the pass laws in which blacks were required to carry passes indicating their employment status, and campaigned for full black citizenship, redistribution of land, trade union rights, and free education for all children. By the end of 1952, Mandela had become such a thorn for the government they decided to serve him a banning order in an attempt to silence him. This severely restricted his freedom of speech and movement. He could not attend public meetings or speak to more than one person at a time. In 1956, Mandela and 150 others were arrested and charged with treason in an attempt to harass anti-apartheid activists. They were eventually acquitted, but the ANC began to fall in popularity following the formation of the Pan-African Congress. The National Party eventually banned both of these organizations. In 1961, after 20 years of peaceful protest, Mandela founded the MK, realizing that armed struggle was the only way to achieve change. The MK was an armed offshoot of the ANC dedicated to sabotage and guerrilla war tactics to end apartheid. In January 1962, Mandela traveled abroad illegally, defying his banning order, to attend a conference of African nationalists, visit the exiled Oliver Tambo, and undergo guerrilla training in Algeria. On August 5th, shortly after his return, he was arrested and subsequently sentenced to 5 years in prison for leaving the country and inciting a workers' strike. The following July, police raided an ANC hideout in Rivonia, a suburb on the outskirts of Johannesburg, and arrested a group of MK leaders who had gathered to debate the merits of a guerrilla insurgency. Mandela was brought to trial again, in which he delivered a stirring opening statement and sealed his iconic status around the world.
I have dedicated my life to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
Mandela admitted to some of the charges against him, but defended the MK and ANC's actions and denounced the injustices of apartheid. However, Mandela was sentenced to life in prison. The winter of 1964 saw a young Mandela dragged to Robben Island prison, where he would spend 18 years of his 27 years in prison. Prison conditions were harsh and oppressive. He only saw one visitor every year for 30 minutes and could write and receive one letter every 6 months. Mandela and the prisoners were verbally and physically harassed by white prison wardens, and the Rivonia trial prisoners spent their days breaking rocks into gravel and repairing roads. However, Mandela's life was not wasted in prison, and he quickly became a symbol of freedom around the world. Just as Mandela repaired roads while in prison, he would soon repair South Africa as a man of forgiveness, because his lengthy time in prison helped Mandela understand, as a leader, even when he had been denied citizenship and freedom in his own country, he could not let hate have the last word. On February 11, 1990, newly elected President F.W. de Klerk ordered Mandela's release and lifted the ban on the ANC. After his release, Mandela led the ANC in negotiations with de Klerk to end apartheid and bring out a peaceful transition to a non-racial democracy. President de Klerk, working closely with Nelson Mandela, called for a non-discriminatory South Africa and terminated the existence of apartheid forever. After the nation's first multiracial elections in history on May 10, 1994, Mandela was sworn in as the first black president of South Africa. As president, he introduced numerous social and economic programs designed to improve the living standards of South Africa's black population. In 1996, Mandela supervised the making of a new South African constitution, which established a strong central government based on majority rule and prohibited discrimination against minorities, including whites. In 1999, after his first term, he retired from politics, treated for prostate cancer in 2001, and weakened by other health issues. Nelson Mandela died on December 5, 2013, from a recurring lung infection. Mandela's encounter with apartheid, a struggle that lasted a lifetime, showed the world that by being determined and steadfast in one's effort, anything is possible. Beginning with his first encounter with racism and segregation in Johannesburg, Mandela never faltered at the sight of oppression in the years to come. Many times throughout his life, Mandela was frightened. However, he never showed his fear. He encountered and triumphed over his fear by realizing he had to become a leader that provided the courage that South Africans were in need of. He came across many difficulties, encountering overwhelming odds, encountering racism, encountering prison, encountering violence, encountering hatred, encountering doubters, encountering suffering, but he never backed down. Mandela embodied the spirit of lifetime struggle against injustice by being a leader whose ideals could never be extinguished, no matter how determined his oppressors were. Mandela's encounter with and conquering of apartheid transformed the nation of South Africa and left an impression on the world that will never be forgotten.